This week we speak with Blake Sanz, winner of the University of Iowa Press Short Fiction Award with The Boundaries of Their Dwelling. Here's what he says about that award.
It's just been one thing after another that's been like a dream. It's been incredible to see the behind-the-scenes process of what goes on to make a book.
Welcome to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. I'm your host, Monica Hadley, and with me is my mother and co-host, Caroline Kilborn.
Hello, everyone. Well, I think fall is upon us in Iowa. Feels like it this morning.
It does, and we're kind of grateful for that, aren't we?
Yes, we are. But in a few weeks it'll be snowing, and then we'll wish we had it warm again.
Yeah, I know.
You're never satisfied, are
This
you?
weather that we have right now is kind of why we put up with the rest of the year here in Iowa.
That's true. That's true.
So, why don't you tell our listeners who we're talking to today?
Well, today we're talking to Blake Sanz. What was it? Sanz?
Yes.
Is that how you pronounce it?
That's right.
Yes. Yeah, Sanz. Okay, and he has a very interesting book. The title of it is The Boundaries of Their Dwelling, and it's a collection of short stories, and they're all kinds of them. I mean, it's really quite interesting. Now, he has published fiction in Ecotone, Puerto del Sol, Fifth Wednesday Journal, and elsewhere, and he teaches writing at the University of Denver and lives in Denver, Colorado. And I think you will find this book very interesting, and it's going to be interesting hearing what he has to say. So welcome to Writers' Voices, everyone.
And the boundaries.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
And The Boundaries of Their Dwelling is the winner of the Iowa Short Fiction Award and is published by the University of Iowa Press. So,
oh, that's right. I'm
yeah.
sorry I forgot to say that. Yeah.
So, Blake, tell us what your connection with Iowa is, since that's where we're calling from.
Sure, yeah, I'm calling from Denver. My connection to Iowa, as far as this book goes, is really just that I submitted the book to a contest that Iowa had going, and they chose the book. But I have had contact with people at Iowa over the years. You know, they've got a really renowned MFA writers workshop there at Iowa, and I've had the fortune to meet a few of the people who've come through that program, and also a couple of people who teach there who have helped me with different projects over the years. So I'm lucky in that regard that I've already got people on the ground in Iowa who have been emailing me and are championing the book. But the press itself is independent of that writers' workshop. And so Jim McCoy runs the press, and he gave me a call one day in January. In fact, it was I got the call at exactly the moment that Biden was being inaugurated. And the call was to say that I had won this contest, which had been judged by Brandon Taylor. If you haven't had a chance to check out his work, I'd highly recommend it. He's a fantastic writer. He's written a novel and a book of short stories, each in the last couple of years. And he's making a big impression, and his books are really great. So it was an honor to be chosen by him for this award. And from there, it's been kind of a whirlwind, you know. From the moment I discovered that this was going to be happening in January to the moment in 3 weeks when it'll come out, it's just been one thing after another that's been like a dream. It's been incredible to see the behind-the-scenes process of what goes on to make a book come to light.
So this is your first published book?
That's right.
Yeah. And how long have you been working and writing the stories that are in this book?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting, there's two different ways you can think about it. On the one hand, you could think of it in terms of just like when was the first story written and the last one. And by that measure, it's taken me 24 years because the first story was written when I was 20, and that was way back in 1997, 98. And the last story, I was just editing it in June of this year. But then it's not really quite accurate to just use that metric because I didn't really think of all those stories as a book that whole time. I was just writing stories that I was looking to get published in magazines, and And it wasn't until maybe about 2016, maybe 2015, somewhere in that range, that I finally realized, oh, some of these stories that I have, I could collect them, I could arrange them, and they would make sense together. And so once I got to 2015 or 16, can't remember exactly when, I started to be more intentional about putting stories together into something that would, stand alone as a book, maybe in the way that musicians think about what songs go into an album. And so I started submitting the book in 2017, and last year in 2020, it was accepted for this award.
Oh, well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, the boundaries of their dwelling is fairly thematically connected. The stories in here. What is
That's right.
What is the connection?
Sure, I can talk about that. So maybe the easiest way to do it is just through the title. So the title comes from a line in the Bible from Acts, I believe. And the full line is, and he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwelling. And it's a line that sometimes I've discovered over the years used by those who oppose certain immigration policies, those who would maybe not want people to be crossing the border and staying here. That line is used as a justification for stricter and tougher immigrant laws. And I found that interesting. And the book, its content is about, at least to some extent, it's about people of Mexican descent who find themselves in the American South, particularly Louisiana, which is where I'm from. So half the book is stories about people of Mexican descent, I would say, making a go of it in the South. But it's also about people in the South having experiences of disconnectedness from home as well. So that manifests in a couple different ways. For example, you have people from the South, and particularly from Louisiana, dealing with hurricanes where their homes are literally destroyed and they have to rebuild. And so they feel dissociated from their homes, even though they've lived there their whole lives. You have characters from the South who go to Mexico to search out family roots, and so they feel kind of dislodged from what they sense as home in those stories. And then there are other stories that have characters from other places who find themselves in the South as well. So you have a German immigrant who comes to New Orleans and is trying to figure out this very strange, very weird place that is New Orleans. So if there's something that connects all the stories, I would say it's that many of the characters across all of the stories are feeling somewhat uprooted in some way, and they're trying to find a place for themselves in the locales where they end up.
Okay, I can see that.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
and then the second half is even a little more. The stories in there are even more connected.
That's
to
right.
one another.
So there are two parts to the book. In the first part, it's kind of a random assortment of characters from these locales in Mexico, and particularly Veracruz and Mexico City, and then also in the Gulf South. And then the second part, as you're referring to, really narrows in and follows a father and a son. And the father is from Mexico, the son is from the Gulf South. And they're estranged. They don't really know each other and haven't. And so the stories in that section alternate back and forth between a story about the father and his life and a story about the son and his. And so you sort of follow them over the course of 20 or so years of their lives, maybe more, and see how they are kind of like, I guess, dancing around the notion of each other in some way at the same time that they're living their own lives. They're both aware of the other, but don't have much chance to connect, and then they actually do have a couple points of connection in the final couple stories. And so in a way you can think of that second part of the book as its own kind of novella, perhaps. It's not precisely a narrative from start to finish, but you get enough touchstones across multiple parts of their lives that you start to feel like there's a complete story there, to a complete arc to the story of the father and the son.
So I'm curious as to why you chose to write that in this form rather than actually writing it as a novel or a novella.
Sure. Yeah. I tried writing a number of different types of things related to these characters. I did write a novel that was never published. That just, for some reason, it wasn't working. I can't quite explain why. I still don't really know the reason why it didn't work. But all the time that I was writing that novel about those characters, I was also writing these stories on the side, which were sort of, I thought then, like complements to that novel. Pieces of the story that I couldn't find a place in the novel, but that I thought were interesting. And little did I know all that time what I was really doing was writing a different book that was maybe a better angle onto that relationship. And part of why I think the short story form works better for these characters' stories is that their stories are pretty fragmented. There's not a through line necessarily of connection. There's not a through line of a development of a relationship. It's more that they're living their own lives independent of each other for most of that time. And so it struck me that maybe excerpting from those lives in the form of complete short stories was a more, I guess the word would be like a truer way to tell the story of these characters as I understood them to exist toward each other.
That makes sense, doesn't it, Caroline?
Mm-hmm. It does. Yeah, it's some. I really like some of these, and some of them I found a little bit harder to understand. But all in all, enjoyed the whole thing. It was interesting.
Well, I'm
to
glad
see how these characters develop.
Now, Blake, what is it in your background that led you to write these stories?
Well, it's probably not too surprising to discover that I'm from the Gulf South and my father's from Mexico. So in a very basic way, I had the raw material just from the facts of my life. I was raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana by my mother and her family. And her family comes from this area of Louisiana, both sort of between Baton Rouge and New Orleans and also a bit to the west of there in what's known by most of the country as kind of like Cajun country. So there's a lot of Cajun blood in my family, and that's a very, I think, unique world to grow up in, apart from the rest of the South. Like, there are parts of that world that feel like the rest of the South, and there are parts of it that are just utterly unique and different. Things around food and music, but also things around language. I mean, it's not so much the case that people speak French there anymore, but it used to be. My grandmother spoke French a little bit, though she never really did it around the house. So that was the world that I grew up in, but I also grew up hearing the stories of this guy, my dad, who was from Mexico and who in the 70s had immigrated to Louisiana. And though my father is Mexican, his mother is actually from Louisiana too. So his whole life he grew up in Mexico, but his mother was from the area where I'm from. And so when he immigrated to Louisiana, he thought to go to the town where she was from because he figured he would have uncles there and a kind of foothold that he could grasp onto. And so it was when he came to that area of Louisiana near Lafayette, Louisiana, if you know that area, he met my mom. And so that's how they got together. And that relationship didn't last very long. And so he wasn't on the scene when I was growing up. He was back in Mexico by then. And so then I was left to kind of like dream about what it would be like to have this father from another country. And the South is a place that has pretty particular views on what it means to be Mexican. And it turns out those ideas are not very much in line with the kind of person my dad is. I think there's a kind of stereotype maybe of Mexicans as day laborers or people who would be blue collar workers that would work in construction. And that was not, my father comes from a family that's, first of all, lighter skinned, which is something that probably would surprise many people in the South, to know that there are people as white Southerners who are as Mexican as anyone you can imagine. So that's one difference. And then another is just that they were, in many ways, I would say like an intellectual family. Like my dad's formative years were spent in the Distrito Federal in the 60s among artists and writers and painters. And he was a painter. And he was in a band, and he was involved in these different political movements that were going on at the time. He's told me stories about hanging out with Alejandro Jodorowsky, who's this big famous director who directed movies that got acclaim and praise from people like John Lennon in the 70s. So that notion of what it meant to be Mexican was very different for me, knowing the stories I knew of my father, than the kind of like typical stories that you would hear from just people in the culture in South Louisiana.
Were you discriminated against for being part Mexican?
Never. I look so white, Melissa. I'm the whitest guy around, so I never felt it by how people looked at me. And my last name, Sanz, it is a variant of a pretty common Mexican name. The more common way to spell that name is Saenz. And Sanz is more of a Spanish name. When I went to Spain many years ago, I was shocked to discover many businesses with my name on it. But that's not the case in Mexico, and I don't even know if many of my classmates would have recognized the name as anything particularly quote-unquote Mexican. So no, there was no discrimination. It was all in my head, I knew that I had a father from another country, and as I got to know more about how the world that I grew up in thought about Mexicans, I started to put it together. Oh, I'm sort of part Mexican, but am I really? Because look how I look. I don't look different. But also I know the story of my dad. So absolutely not. There was no discrimination against me. And my experience of being half Mexican in Louisiana is, I got to think, pretty unique.
Probably, yeah. And of course, Blake, the name Blake, is not Mexican or Cajun either, really.
Right, and Blake isn't even my real name. Blake is a variant of my middle name. My middle name is a strange one that comes from my mom's family. The full name is Blakely, spelled Bleakley. It's a nod to my mom's grandmother. Her maiden name was Blakely. My first name is Manuel. So if you see and of course on bank cards these days and most official forms of identification, you have to use your full name. And so, when I run a bank card somewhere and it prints out Manuel Sanz, well then people start to look at me and think, how is this dude Manuel Sanz? But it's it's my name. So
yeah.
But my mother did call me by Blake as a kid, so I always grew up responding to that name. And since I've become an adult, I spend a fair amount of time in Mexico, as much as I can, and I spend as much time as I can in the South and Louisiana as well. And it would never occur to me to go by Manuel in Louisiana. And my family in Mexico actually prefers to call me Blake as well, though if I'm talking with strangers in Mexico City or Veracruz, I'll go by Manuel, just because it's easier for them to pronounce. It's easier for them to sort of associate that name with people that they know. But it's sort of been a kind of silly little internal struggle that I've had for a while, trying to figure out who am I to these different people in these different places. So to call myself Manuel in Mexico is almost to try to adopt a pose of being Mexican, which when I'm in Mexico, no one thinks have anything to do with Mexico by looking at me.
But
So
how
to go by Manuel feels like a little bit like a pose, even though it's not.
Yeah. You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and our guest today is Blake Sanz, author of The Boundaries of Their Dwelling, a short story collection, and winner of the Iowa Short Fiction Award that is launching October 15th, 2021 from the University of Iowa Press. So at what point did you learn to speak Spanish?
I learned to speak Spanish the same way that any kid in the south of Louisiana would, which is to say just by schooling.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I took my first class when I was 13, maybe 12. And before that, I had told my mom that I really wanted to learn it precisely because I knew that my dad was from Mexico. And so she had given me some tapes to use to learn the language. But I should say, like, I don't feel fluent. I can get by, and there's a recent movie that came out called Language Lessons with, I think, Jay Duplass and an actress who plays a woman from Costa Rica. And in this movie, the man has lost his partner, and before his partner's died, the partner has given him these language lessons and in Spanish, and he knows that the Jay Duplass character used to speak some but doesn't anymore, and so the relationship then between the Spanish teacher and the protagonist plays out mostly in Spanish. And if anyone's seen that movie, the level of aptitude that that character has with Spanish is about my level. Which is to say, when you watch it, you know, the whole conversation is in Spanish. But as I listen, I'm like, he's messing up some grammar here and there. The language is pretty simple. And I think the main reason that I've never reached any level of fluency is that, beyond that, is that when I go to Mexico, these are people that I want to know very well. You know, I learned when I was in my early 20s that I had a half sister, and I wanted to get to know her. I had never met any of my dad's brothers and sisters and my cousins. And so, you know, I went to Mexico once as a 10-year-old, again as a 22-year-old. My main focus wasn't learning the language better. My main focus was learning who these people were. And because all of them spoke very fluent English, the easiest way for that to happen was in English. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, it's a minor complaint, but when I think back about my time in Mexico, I'm like, man, I wish I could get some more practice in the language. But and sometimes they'll start to ask really important questions to me about my life in Spanish, and I'll answer in Spanish. But at a certain point, it'll break down because I don't have the language that I want to have to express the complicated emotion that I have. And so then they'll just switch to English, and I'll be much more, you know, forthcoming. I do have one aunt, my Aunt China in Mexico City, who just refuses to talk to me in English. Yeah, she doesn't refuse, but she makes a point of always speaking in Spanish, and I really appreciate that about her.
That's nice. That's nice. I've been spending some time in Mexico recently on business. I was a month or so ago, I was in Chihuahua and Pachuca and briefly Mexico City. And I'll be going back there this month. And it's, even though my Spanish, I studied in high school. I went to Spain after high school for a month. When I got by really well, I really had fairly good, not fluency again, but I could get along. But then, you know, that's been 40 years. So, things change. But it's pretty easy to get along in English down there.
It is. In my experience, the language, the Spanish goes very quickly when I don't go for a while, and then it comes back if I'm there long enough. So I feel you. I know what you mean.
Yeah. So, Blake, how autobiographical is the story of Manuel and Tommy, and how much like your own father is Manuel?
There's a lot there. I wouldn't say it's fully autobiographical. There were lots of moments just when I was working with issues of craft, and I wanted to make the story fit a version of what I wanted a story to be, that I changed things. But I certainly would I'd draw a harsh line and say these are fictional characters, even if they share a lot of similarities with myself and with my dad. I mean, the truth is that I don't know my dad that well even today. So for me to even write these stories was an act of imagination.
Has he read them?
He has, yeah. We hadn't really spoken much for years. You could probably pick it up in the book that the son just sort of has this longing to know this guy, and that's certainly true to my own experience. But so the parts where the son is sort of longing to know this character are absolutely autobiographical. The parts where I actually fill in the details of the character of Manuel are more imaginative, because I just don't know. But yeah, he has read them. He has been more in contact within the last couple of years, and it's been really, in a way, like a lifelong dream come true to have some sort of relationship now with him that feels honest and that feels genuine. He lives in Mexico City now, and I think it's partly a result of just the world we live in with technology, that he's now a person that has a WhatsApp and can text me in that way. That's how we communicate, and that he's discovered WhatsApp here in the 2010s, and now into the 2020s, has really been why we're in more constant contact than we have been before.
Right. Well, it makes it a lot easier for sure.
Yeah.
So, Blake, why don't you read part of the story from The Boundaries of Their Dwelling?
Sure. So I'll read from In the City of Murals. This is a short story in which this character has come from Mexico to South Louisiana, and he's married quickly, and he's trying to set up a business there in this small town in Louisiana. So here's a little bit from that story. In the City of Murals. In the first days of the couple's unlikely marriage, it became the airbrush artist's habit to follow his American wife about the tiny kitchen of their rented house, daydreaming aloud to her in Spanish as she prepared dinner. Most often, he shared his plans to open a screen printing and art shop in the small town where they lived, nearby Utesh. Hoy hice el letrero, Pearl. Mañana lo montaré. I made the sign today, Pearl. I'm putting it up tomorrow. She understood only her name and mañana. Spiced chicken cubes sizzled when she spilled them into the pan. His hands held her sides to feel when she needed to move past him, for there were many places for her to be when she cooked. He continued, in Spanish. It's big and blue with black letters, Manny's. Each letter is in a different font. I made the M and the S big, and they connect, like an underline. The apostrophe is a little shirt. You can come soon and tell me what you think. As he paced behind her in the small room, he had to watch for cabinets ajar and the sharp edges of counter corners, and so he could not look at her as they moved like a two-car train from the counter to the stove to the sink. I'm going to make the first shirts for the festival tomorrow. Would you like me to screen one for you? She stood over the faucet, washing her hands of raw chicken and chili powder, the room thick with the smell of cumin and cilantro. Bueno, he whispered into her ear. She understood that word, too, and smiled. During their brief courtship, she had prepared him Cajun dishes from recipes handed down to her by her mother. Since the wedding, though, she had cooked with tortillas and onions, tomatoes and cheese. He liked the shift, but the new dishes didn't resemble the food of his childhood. This was his fault. He could have shared more about his life in Mexico, but he wanted to think of himself only as American now. For this reason, Pearl's imagined version of his youth in Veracruz became a false oasis, shimmering at the edges of their interaction. But because he saw how it made her feel about him to imagine it, he didn't want to dissolve her vision. And anyway, he liked her attempts at Mexican food, even if they weren't authentic. They returned to the stove so she could prepare a sauce. He let go of her and walked to the living room, where he felt her gaze as he looked at one of his pieces tacked to the wall above the old couch. It was a sparrow in profile, cut out of cream construction paper. In the middle of its breast, he had burned a hole through which showed light blues and whites, the color of the sky and the clouds. "Would you like me to make you a shirt from this print?" he asked her in English. She smiled at him. "Yes," she said. She chopped garlic and chilies for a sauce and put them into a cast-iron pot with onions. She took store-brand cheddar from the fridge and cut a big cube into a pan to melt it over the stove. Though this was a special dinner, the fresh vegetables had left no money for good cheese. She placed a stack of tortillas in a cradle of foil and put them in the toaster oven to warm. She joined him in the living room then to wait for dinner. They sat down on the couch, a hand-me-down from Pearl's mother, and sank into its broken springs. He draped his arm around her, and she laid her head on his chest. He could feel the weight of her wrist against his abdomen. "Are you sure the loan will go through?" she asked. The sauce bubbled beneath their words. "Of course," he said. "It's been a while. That's why I went ahead and started. I didn't want to wait on the bank forever." "Even if you didn't know about the loan? But what did you have for collateral?" "This is a small town. They understand the problems of starting a small business. Yesterday, Harry, from the bank? He said that he would visit the store tomorrow to give me the final yes. He said that twice already, which is why he won't cancel again." She asked if Harry had questioned his citizenship. He deflected the question, but she persisted. "I know you're a dual citizen," she said, "but that doesn't matter to them." He reminded her patiently for the umpteenth time that his mother's family had lived here respectably for years. He was, in fact, only half Mexican. His grandmother, a quiet and humble member of the Prejean family, known in these parts for generations, was a friend of Harry's aunt. When, as usual, this didn't assuage Pearl, he resorted to defending the promise of his business based on how their small town had recently begun to support the arts with the inception of a new local festival. Yes, he was new here. No, he wasn't a gamble. She admired his confidence, though she didn't share it, and to distract herself from her worries, she focused on his looks. Her Manuel had jet black hair, and he was much taller than most Mexicans. He was light-skinned, and you could see traces of his ethnicity in his facial structure, both the Cajun and the Mexican, though when he spoke Spanish, most people around here usually saw only the latter. As he had told her, he was capable of speaking English without an accent. As a child in Veracruz, he had learned English well enough from his mother that he knew from an early age what it should sound like. When he concentrated, he could make himself sound American, but mostly he found the effort distracting. To think about his own words too much made him forget what he was trying to say. And so, more often than not, he spoke with a slight accent, just enough for people in Rain to question whether he was foreign.
Thank you. That was Blake Sanz reading from The Boundaries of Their Dwelling.
How long did it take you to decide which stories you were going to use in this book? Did you have some other ones that you were choosing from as well, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a good question. And yes, I did. I had other ones. In one sense, it became a very logistical question. There were stories that I had written that I quite liked and thought had a place in this book, but I had changed facts about characters' lives in ways that made them incompatible plot-wise with stories that did make the cut. And so that was the main question that I had to tinker with is which stories just messed with the plot too much. I think in one story, I made the Manuel character be from a different town than he's from in the stories that appear here, for example. And there were other more central features of certain characters that it wouldn't make sense to just change those things. for the sake of making them fit into the book. And so for those reasons, some stories got cut, the ones that have to do with either Manuel or Tommy that didn't make it. And then, there were a number of stories that could have gone into that first part of the book that's not about those two characters. And that was, those questions or those choices were more thematic. It was just a question of what was the larger vision that I had for what those early stories in the book could do. And some just didn't fit. And so I cut them.
The characters in those earlier stories seem to be, a lot of them, very kind of troubled. Was that part of, was that intentional?
Just in the sense that, like, I find troubled people to be interesting. I think that their lives, are worth telling stories about. I would probably never, it would never occur to me to write a story about someone whose life is just great. I think that would be boring.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Did you always want to be a writer?
I guess I would say yes, although I didn't necessarily know that I wanted that until I got to college. I was a very typical kid in a lot of ways for the area that I come from. Sports is kind of a religion where I come from, and I grew up playing basketball, and so I had the idea that I wanted to do that, and I did do that through college, and that was fun. But, pretty quickly by the time you get to be 16 or 17, you start to realize that that's probably not a real option. And I think sort of like coming to that very basic awareness, I started to think about, well, what else would I want to do or could I do? And I was already starting to write things for the high school newspaper. And by the time I got to college, I was really excited to take some creative writing classes. And my mentor there, John Bigonnet at Loyola, was, in my memory, he was this really hard to please teacher. And in this one class I took with him, which was my first creative writing class, I can remember writing a story that I thought was good, and it was just covered in critique after I had written it. And then I wrote a second one that was just as harshly critiqued. And so I thought, man, this is harder than I thought it was. But I found myself wanting to rise to the challenge. And then the third story that I wrote for him, he didn't say much, but he did say at the end of our conversation about it, he said, congratulations, you've written a good story. And it was a very kind of cathartic moment of realization that, well, you can't just have some sort of like affinity for words. You have to actually work at this. And I liked the combination, that I was already a person who had an affinity for words, but also I could see that it would take some work to get where I wanted to get. I didn't know it would take 20 years, but I knew it would take a lot of work.
And so how long have you been teaching writing?
Let's see. I got my degree from Notre Dame in 2001 and immediately started teaching back in my old hometown at LSU in 2001 in the fall. So 20 years. I've been teaching for 20 years.
Wow. And are you as hard on your students as your mentor was on you?
Definitely not. This is a different generation, and I've adapted my teaching style over the years. I try to be encouraging as a baseline response to any student's work, and then if I detect from a student that they're really serious about it, then I'll try to be a little harsher with my criticism and try to be clear about why I'm doing that. So no, I wouldn't say that I'm the same as my mentor was with me.
It's an interesting thing because that if you like you say, baseline encouragement, and it's important when people are starting out to feel encouraged and they're putting their work out there. But on the other hand, if not everybody really is cut out to make a living as a writer, and if somebody is feeling if somebody really doesn't have what it takes,
right, they need to know.
They need to know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a typical kind of response that a kid would get from me about their writing would be, wow, yeah, you did some really great things here. And then if they talked to me, they would get this sense of encouragement. And then when they looked at the actual markups that I've put down on the page, they might be like, wait, I thought he said I did a great job, but there are tons of marks on the paper. So, the signs are there for them to see that, like, just because I thought they did a great job doesn't mean that it's perfect. There's still a lot of work to be done. And I think a lot of kids would take that and they would say, well, this is more work than I would care to put forth for something that I would do for the rest of my life.
And also there's also the case that your judgment of whether something is something you would want to read isn't necessarily the judgment of the entire marketplace either. So
that's right.
It'd be hard to be a writing teacher in college, I would think, because there's so many different personalities and so many different stories and everything, and you have to be judgmental, and it's hard. Isn't it very hard to do that?
I know very well how hard it is for them to do it because I did it for so long, especially when you write from a place of your own experience, and you sort of take these experiences and you fashion them into something, you fabricate them into something that you think a larger audience would be interested in, and then to get a rejection from, let's say, a magazine for a story that, is sort of central to your sense of self, it's an emotional blow. And so a lot of times when I comment on students' work, I try to make a very clear point that this is no judgment on them as a person, and that the people who would potentially down the line, like, read their story in a magazine or something, those people don't know anything about you. They're not trying to make some judgment on your life. They're just trying to make a judgment on the words. And it's really hard, even now, after all these years, for me to always be good at doing that. And so I try to speak from a place of experience. But you're right that there's just no way around the fact that writing can be deeply personal. You're really exposing a lot of just how you see the world. And for someone to say, well, the way that you see the world, I'm not interested in. That's not an easy thing to hear.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and that's really what a rejection is, isn't it? Ugh.
It feels like it. I mean, I don't think that it really is that, but to a writer just starting out, it certainly feels that way.
Certainly feels that way. You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. Our guest today is Blake Sanz, author of The Boundaries of Their Dwelling, which is a collection of short stories. So how did when did you start getting stories published? How many of the stories in this collection have been previously published? Tell us a little bit about your history of publication.
Yeah, it's been a long and frustrating journey, like it is for pretty much every writer that I know. Let's see, I'm looking at the contents here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 of the 16 stories in the book have been published. The first one was published, I remember, in 2006. I got a note in the mail from a little magazine called Xavier Review out of New Orleans. I had met the editor at a conference, and he had encouraged me to submit, and I had had no luck. I finished my graduate degree in writing in 2001. So from 2001 to 2006, I was sending stories out and not getting anything. I was getting nice notes from editors who would say, this has promise, keep sending us other stuff, but this one isn't right for us. Mm-hmm. And so to get that acceptance in 2006 felt, it was just enough to keep me going. Like I thought, oh, okay, well, somebody got it. Somebody understood what I was trying to do in the story. And it was a thrill. It was a very tiny magazine, but to get that copy in the mail and to see my own words in print was a pretty magical experience. And, from 2006 to 2019, when I submitted, or 2020, I would just, keep submitting to different magazines, and over the years form these kind of like quasi-relationships with editors who would keep saying, keep trying, you're close. Thanks for sending again. I remember your last story. And, these are the little breadcrumbs that you're thrown in the literary world that keep you going. And so piece by piece, I just started to get a couple more. I'd say a big break for me was in 2014. I applied to be a part of this writers conference called Breadloaf Writers Conference, and was awarded a chance to have some funding for that and to go to that conference where, for me, I really got a sense when I got there what I had been up against without knowing it. There's so many editors and agents and publishers and well-established writers that I got to know in that setting. And just to hear the way that they talked about their own journeys to publication was in one sense validating, like, everyone goes through this. And in another sense, there were people there who just seemed to have been put on a track from an early age towards success, and they knew all the right people. And I realized that knowing the right people mattered to a certain degree. That was just a little frustrating. But now I was a person who was starting to know those people. And so I couldn't be too mad anymore, because now I sort of had access to editors who asked for stories. The world is sort of nepotistic. I wouldn't say that it's entirely that way. I think there's a lot of editors who are genuinely looking for the best thing that they can find. And a lot of the times it doesn't matter that you know people if your work isn't up to par. But I did feel a shift, I have to say. From that point in 2014 through 2019, I had more success publishing stories and applying for different fellowships and residencies and conferences. I got a lot of opportunities to continue to meet other people in the publishing industry. And yet, there was plenty of rejection in that period too. And I think, it was a few years after that I finally realized that the stories themselves could be a book, as I had mentioned earlier. Most of that time I had been thinking of the stories just as a way to maybe establish some presence in the literary world. And I really thought that my break would come through the novels that I was writing in those years. I wrote 3 different novels across those years, and nothing ever happened with any of them. So yeah, the journey to publication for each story has its own story, and it's been a long road, but I feel glad that I was patient, that I got 3/4 of the stories out, that was able to happen gave me some measure of confidence that the stories had some merit that not only I saw, but that other people in the literary world saw, so that when I submitted to these contests in 2019 and 2020, I could feel decent that they stood a chance of being recognized.
Now, when you submitted, to the University of Iowa Short Fiction Award contest, do you submit the entire collection?
That's right.
Okay.
It pretty much has to be as perfect as it can possibly be. I had worked on those stories for decades, and I had zero left to give to them, emotionally or grammatically. They were what they were, and they were either going to be taken or not at that point. And I think if you're going to submit to contest, it's got to be that you feel absolutely certain that you have every word right. And
so it's not like when you're writing a novel and you submit it, and then there's this whole big editing process that's going to happen after they accept it. That's not what happens here.
Well, there's going to be an editing process after they accept it. That's absolutely true in either case. The thing is that professional editors, will be able to see things that even in 20 years you would not see. So I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that there's no editing after you submitted it. I would say that if you're going to submit a novel, it has to be the same thing. You have to have every word just as you think it needs to be. And you'll discover, I think, although I haven't published a novel yet, I think you'll probably discover that there'll be plenty that you're asked to change, even after that.
Right, of course. Yeah. So how much did the stories change after, so they'd been published before, but You still made some changes to them for this book?
I did, although in my case there weren't too many major changes. There were a couple of corrections just to make sure that characters aligned with each other across multiple stories. The book got a thorough copy edit. But in this case, they had no real like substantive content edits for me to make, which was surprising. And I guess it was sort of a testament to the fact that I had worked so hard for so long on them. In fact, when they accepted the book back in January, Iowa has a really fast turnaround from acceptance of that book to publication. So from January to October, basically, was that sprint for the book from manuscript form to having it in my hands. And I think at other houses and other publishers, that process doesn't take 9 months. It takes a year and a half. It takes 2 years. And so there was a lot of things that were happening really fast. And I don't think that they would have taken the book had they not imagined that it was already pretty close to how they needed it to be.
Right. How involved were you in like the cover design and the physical layout?
Yeah, I have to say I love the physical layout. I love the cover. It did give me some input into it, and I really enjoyed being a part of that process. For those who can't see the book, I'll describe it. It's a nice bright yellow cover, and there's sort of this, I describe it as like a Frankenstein heart made out of different pieces of plants, plants that have their origins in Mexico. So it's like a plant-made heart on this like stucco yellow background. It's really striking.
It is.
And so the process was that I was told that they had hired a company and a person to work on this book, and a person from Iowa served as a liaison to that company. And so they asked me, what are your ideas? Like, what are images for you that come to mind when you think about this book? And what are examples of covers of short story collections in the past that you've really liked? And so I came up with a list of like 10 or 15 covers that I thought were really great, and I tried to explain for each one why I liked it. You know, I pulled out some images from the book that I thought were important, and then I tried to find, like, I Google searched for images like those and sent them along. So, like, what they got from me was a set of images that I thought was sort of like what I thought was important in the book, and a set of 10 or 15 existing book covers for short story collections. And then from that, they went off and sort of worked on their own, and maybe a month later, 6 weeks later, they had a mock-up that was pretty close to what the book looks like now. And we made some small suggestions, small changes from there to the end. But, I mean, most of the work was done by Derek Thornton at Notch Design, a guy that I never had any contact with. The person that I had contact with was at Iowa and was working both with Derek and with me.
Interesting.
And so we spoke through this intermediary. And like I said, I'm really thrilled with what it looks like. So no, I couldn't just like pick my own cover or design my own cover, but I did get some input into the guiding principles of the cover.
Now, many of your characters, or there's a lot of, immigrants, a lot of, that you mentioned the experience of being sort of disconnected from where you live. But you haven't actually been an immigrant. Have you spoken to immigrants and how, in terms of whether they feel you're portraying the experience in a way that resonates with them?
The ones that I've spoken to the most are just my father and my sister. And their stories, and my sister's not an immigrant, but she has come to this country. And a couple of the stories are not necessarily immigrants, but people from another country visiting this country.
Right, right.
So outside of my family, no. I haven't spoken to specific immigrants. I think part of what's interesting about an immigrant experience of America is that we want to typify what that's like. We want to say that there's a path that's typical. But a part of what I hope one might get from reading these stories is that maybe there is no typical path. I was talking to you earlier about the sort of strange circumstances of my dad's immigration here, which didn't end up working. He couldn't stay and had to go back. So I certainly don't mean in this collection to sort of have a set of experiences that I think is a stand-in for the Mexican immigrant experience. In fact, I think that the experiences in this book probably push against whatever the typical notion of that immigrant experience is. But no,
that's
I did not
interesting.
consult any other immigrants.
Yeah, and also it's like you said, it's the feeling of being a stranger in a place. Everybody has experienced that at one time or another.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Like, I wanted to have my characters feel that sense of strangeness. And some of the characters who feel that sense of strangeness are immigrants, but some of them are not. Some of them are rooted in a place for decades. And, weather,
Right. Oh, yeah. That one, the one about the hurricane.
Hurricane Gothic, right.
Yeah. That was fascinating. Well, Blake, we're almost out of time, and just real quickly, what's next for you in writing?
In writing, so I've written a novel that I'm excited to be close to finished with, and when that novel is done, I'll send it out and hope for the best. The novel is called The Interior Castle, which is the title comes from the title of a work by St. Teresa of Avila, who wrote a book called The Interior Castle hundreds of years ago, in which she describes kind of her path to union with God. And in this novel that I'm writing, I have a character who's a Carmelite monk living in seclusion with other monks in the West Texas desert. And so I follow his life, and I follow the life of his cousin. These are two family members who had sort of a brother-like bond with each other because they were both only children but lived in the same city. And so they had kind of made this pact with each other that they would always be there for each other after the monk character's father dies. But then the monk character goes off to live in the desert, and so the other cousin feels somewhat abandoned by that. And so the novel follows each character's sort of individual path towards fulfillment in life, one through this solitary life in the desert and the other through this bigger life that involves travel across the globe, trying to make a big name for himself. So I guess I'm interested in this book in questions of what solitude can do for people, how obligation works within families, the role that spirituality and religion play. And this is especially interesting to write during the pandemic when all of us are sort of like living in our own little bubbles.
Well, you definitely go after some big themes. And Blake, so I look forward to hopefully seeing that in print one of these days, The Interior Castle. And Mom, do you have some closing words for us?
Yes, everybody has a story. It may be happy, sad, uplifting, tragic, but everybody has a story because we're all on the journey of life. So I'm glad that he's writing these, and maybe he'll write his own story someday.
Well, thank Blake, you, I'm really happy to have joined you. I can't thank you enough for letting me come on your program.
Well, thank you. And October 15th, publication date for The Boundaries of Their Dwelling. And see you all next week on Writers' Voices.